If you're walking with me through this season, it's like we're on a ship at night, sailing, leaving port, and I see on this ship there's a safe inner room, but on the deck in the darkness there's no guardrails, and so there's a risk of being swept overboard if your sight is not adjusted in the dark. These days are not physical darkness, it's a spiritual darkness that's descended on us, and so it's important that you learn how to see in the spirit to understand these days and to be able to navigate through the season that we're in. Today's headlines that I hear the Holy Spirit whispering to me, Hunter Biden's laptop is a key piece of the puzzle to expose his relationship with the enemy states, Burisma Holdings, China, and foreign political ties with gains for private wealth in exchange for public power. It's a key part of the puzzle. And this is the crime of handing one's own nation over to enemy actors at a national level. This is high treason. Public power is granted to protect the people of the nation, not to feather one's own nest and exhaust the nation with a relentless assault on their assets, health, privacy and security. The risk is about fraud. It's about fraud in high office, misappropriation of funds, misfeasance, collusion, sedition, treason by state officials on behalf of their own citizens. Lies, 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 and fake virtue. That's what's going on, and that's an important part of the picture that's unraveling. And of course, heading up to the election, one of the reasons why the election won't be held is if there's an outbreak of global war, they can suspend the election process. And so there's an increasing pressure against Russia with provocations coming from Ukraine, shooting rockets into neighboring countries. Serbia's been hit with rockets, and Russia now preparing to be hit in capital cities, big cities around Russia, with incoming missile strikes provided by NATO through Ukraine on behalf of Western nations. Up to the election, that's a big risk that Putin is anticipating. We also have a word I keep hearing is about the former president of Brazil, that he was also involved in illicit affairs and he's betrayed his nation, and I'm not too sure the details of that. He was an ex-military man and he's been sidelined for the new president to take office, but his hands are not clean in all of the dealings that have gone on, and even in the present moment his hands are not clean. He's playing both sides of the fence in a similar way to Turkey, who's now announced that they're going to align themselves with the BRICS coalition, which is Brazil, India, Russia, China and South Africa, and that's becoming a very influential political bloc to destabilize the US economy. It's also including a lot of countries in Africa now who've aligned themselves with Russia because they're offended by the liberalization of Western politics to such an extent that they can no longer align themselves politically, socially, morally with the West, and so they're choosing Russia. And that's been a long-standing strategy between the East and the Western worlds through aid provision. So these countries in the underdeveloped part of South America and Africa leverage their relationship with the States and Russia through weapons and arms and aid. They play a game in the middle with their hand out for both sides and align themselves politically either with the East or the West. That's continuing to be the story, but in Africa many of the nations have chosen Russia, North Africa specifically, lining themselves up with the first beast that rises out of the sea. That's the leopard with the bare feet in Revelation 13. That's what it's talking about. Also, Daniel talks about this coalition. Ezekiel discusses it in chapter 38 and 39. That's what's happening with BRICS to destabilize the US economy so that China can rise to be the global hegemon over two blocks, East and Western blocks, one centralized in Western Europe, which Brussels is the key player in that bloc, and the other through Russia, Iran, China, and their allied nations with a different currency than what we've previously had as the dominant currency, which has been the US economy backed by oil and gold and trade influence over military power over the whole world. So that's two things: Hunter Biden's laptop, the former president of Brazil with dirty hands, Russia preparing for more assaults, and I also hear arrest warrants being prepared. Australian Labor government has started a page where the public can now report disinformation, which is a sign that the Australian government are aligning themselves with British policy, which will end up in people being prosecuted for cybersecurity crimes, recognised as a threat, sedition against the establishment on this whole of society doctrine that's being promoted by America, or who is corrupted by enemy influence. So those Burisma relationships with Hunter Biden and the money laundering that was going on through Ukraine and his relationship with Chinese officials is a key part of the corruption problem, key evidence to undo what's going on and to prove high crimes against the nation, treason at a high level, which is influencing Australian politics, Canadian politics, also New Zealand and America. We're all under this same umbrella of political influence through the Five Eyes coalition. So expect there to be increasing degrees at Daniel 11:33 in this 42 months of war against the saints. We're on the back foot. So if it is the case that Kamala Harris, through whatever mechanism they activate to win the election, if that's the case, that she becomes the leader and the Holy Spirit has indicated that will be the way it works out, and she will influence a disaster. She will be overseeing bloodshed abroad and chaos, and she'll be mocked and ridiculed and brought down from her position eventually and removed. But there may be a season where she is in control of the American political regime under the influence of these foreign powers, driving covertly from behind the scenes, driving policy formation in America, and then through the subsidiary states, Australia, New Zealand, Canada, and the UK. So we're seeing evidence of that prosecution of speech and thought crimes now, the cracking down of criticism against the state happening in the United Kingdom, because the government are defending, fortifying the lies that have been told in the last 4 years, not calling a spade, and defending the institution and the actors within the institution against the public's criticism and outrage at what has happened. So in Australian Parliament, our parliamentarians requested a Freedom of Information document to disclose the risks, the foreknowledge of the harms that the vaccines potentially could have caused to the public, and that document was presented to the Australian Parliament fully redacted, so completely concealed, not to be open for public view, to protect the institution. And the vote that went through to have an inquiry into COVID for the last 4 years has also been dismissed, voted out of Parliament, so that won't be happening. So fortifying lies, protecting corruption for self-interest against the interests of the nation and at risk of public safety is an abuse of power. It's treasonous, it's traitorous, it's a misappropriation of funds, and it's a misuse of that responsibility that's been granted on behalf of the nation to preserve the well-being and the wealth and the health and the peace and security, not as an appearance, but in fact. It actually has to be evidenced by reality that the security of the nation is the foremost concern of public servants. That's their role as democratic representatives. But we are no longer operating under those terms. We're operating under secret deals that have been made without our participation, and that's what the World Economic Forum operates as. At the highest level, it's a private club where they boast about there being convenience in having secret meetings between people who could otherwise not talk to each other on the public stage transparently. Business leaders, private capital, and members of your elected government making deals, brokering things behind your back, and there has been an agreement made secretly that China will be the hegemon, no longer America, and that these two giant blocks of power are going to be formed, one in the east and one in the west. So I have seen this happening, and I've seen the signs of it, the Ukraine conflict over Crimea, Russia, the war in 2022 that broke out, was a decoy to distract us from what was going on in Brussels, to cause us to pay attention. These people are ruthless. They'll go to great lengths, expensing enormous amount of human life in the process to rearrange society, the geopolitical power in our globe, the way that they want it. And Klaus Schwab actually boasted about this. He chortled about it quite happily in his book about the quintessential transformational Second World War, in a similar way, centralized power through the United Nations. And that's become the vehicle that they've been able to capture the nation state through a succession of treaties that were rolled out from early on, initially the development funds, the Reconstruction Bank, Bretton Woods, the Marshall Plan, and then in the 70s a new set of treaties came through. The United Nations Human Rights Declarations were there in the 50s, and these turned into the environmental doctrines. And it was in about the 90s they started talking about carrying capacity, the environmental issues, and there was a unspoken belief by some of the Malthusian idea, which is that overpopulation was going to be our existential doom, that we were going to die because there's too many people on Earth. And so there's an underlying unspoken, in some regards, officially at least, policy of depopulation to reduce the exponential growth of human activity on the Earth to save the Earth. So that's what's going on, and all these other covert methods of achieving that are not being presented honestly for what they are. So the risk of loss of life, aged care, young, the fertility suppression, the risk sharing of dangerous experimental vaccines, for example, is being shifted in the domain of the public and away from the corporations who are promoting these products and these drugs. And it's become unofficially agreed to that is the way that we need to go to save ourselves from existential doom. Not everybody agrees that depopulating the planet is the way to go, but we are heading for a massive population collapse through a number of different mechanisms. So they are the headlines.